All right, it's now 3 minutes past 2, which I think is enough leeway for anyone who's just hopping on, perhaps finishing lunch or a separate meeting. We want to get started, so let's jump right in. This is the inside story on the 7th Carbon Budget, an audience for the Climate Change Committee. My name is Joe Webb, Chief Growth Officer here at Kamma, and I'm joining you live from the London commuter belt. More importantly, we've got some great experts here with me. I'm joined by Otto Shields, CEO and co-founder of Kamma, and Simon Rayner, lead policy analyst, residential buildings. Good afternoon to you both.
Hi, Joe. Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining.
Just take a moment just to introduce yourselves to the audience. We'll then get started.
Simon, I'll let you go first.
Okay. Hi, I'm Simon Rayner. I'm an analyst in our buildings team at the Climate Change Committee. So I'm not the Climate Change Committee. I'm on the Secretariat, which produces the analysis and writes the reports on behalf of the committee. I've been working at the Climate Change Committee for nearly 5 years now. So I worked on the 6th Carbon Budget, and more recently I've been working on the analysis and the complex modelling for residential buildings for the 7th Carbon Budget. And prior to joining the CCC, my background is that I'm a qualified architect, so I spent quite a long time working in private architectural practice.
And I'm Orla Shields. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Kamma. Kamma's been around for about 7 years now, and I guess our raison d'etre is really about climate data, particularly for the built environment. So this is the type of area that we obsess in, and as a result, we've developed quite a lot of advanced models, and we're very proud to say that we were part of informing the 7th Carbon Budget. So great to be able to discuss with everybody here today, and great to see such a fantastic turnout.
Yes, thanks for that. One of the reasons we're so excited about today is because there's a really great two-way opportunity. So first of all, those of us working in the built environment will be very familiar with the work of Simon and the wider CCC. We don't always get a chance to hear it from the horse's mouth, so to speak. So it's a great chance for us to learn a bit more there. It's also a good chance for Simon to speak directly to this audience, bearing in mind most publications are to the industry at large. So hopefully a good opportunity for you to ask questions, to deliver feedback, and to keep the conversation flowing as well. Any questions throughout today, please do drop them into the chat box, and we'll get through as many as we can before the end of the session. One last point from me. To say, obviously, it's really important to all of us that we protect the integrity of the CCC as far as possible. Kamma is a commercial organisation. We have a right to an opinion, and at various points throughout this webinar, we'll be expressing some points which are Kamma's rather than the CCC's. For the sake of argument, please assume that anything I say is our opinion rather than his. And Simon's, very capable of having his own point of view and things. He'll also keep us honest in terms of sticking through to what's actually part of the core pathway, as opposed to where we're adding additional points to it. So bear in mind that what I say is not necessarily endorsed by the CCC. With that, then we'll jump in. First of all, again, I suppose we've got a decent audience. There may be people who aren't as familiar with the 7th Carbon Budget. The idea of the budget is it informs government policy by illuminating and devising pathways towards net zero. Now, bear in mind that net zero itself is a legally binding target. The UK government can be taken to court if we aren't on target, if we aren't achieving that. But the pathways themselves, the work the CCC does, is not legally binding. It's advice on how we get there, if you like. The 7th Carbon Budget covers the period from 2038 to 2042, with other budgets before that leading up to that point. And it sets clear targets for how we reduce emissions across all sectors, as well as the pathways, the data, the insights, the information on how we get there. Kamma's role within this was a straightforward one. I was going to say a simple one, but it was not in any way simple. I think our product and data teams might kill me if I said that. To begin with, we had to ingest massive reams of data in order to deliver a view on 29 million properties, as opposed to only those we had data on. We had to do some sophisticated and deep level of modeling to predict missing attributes and fill in that data set. Wherever properties were meaningfully different from each other, we had to therefore come up with an opportunity for different pathways towards net zero. And we found out they were different by allocated them into different archetypes. In total, there are 11,000 different archetypes, which means 11,000 different routes to net zero for UK property. And for each of those archetypes and those properties, we looked at all available improvement measures such that we had a full library to choose from. So that's a little bit on Kamma's role. Simon, can you talk us through what the CCC then did with that data?
Yeah, so I mean, we collaborated closely with Kamma in producing that data set, and we then took that data and built a complicated model around it, which is probably the most complicated model that we use in the CCC. And what that model does is it looks at all of the possible combinations of different types of energy efficiency measures and low carbon heating systems, which could be applied to each archetype. So actually what it comes up with is way more than 11,000 options for delivering the pathway, because for each archetype you can end up with 30, 40, 50 plus combinations. It then works out the costs, the lifetime costs of installing those measures, and in fact both the capex and the opex. And for each archetype, it chooses the cheapest option. So it's a cost optimizing model. And then once it's made that selection, it then works out how those measures can be deployed over time, taking into account things like constraints on supply and demand, and uses that to produce a pathway for deploying those measures. It then works out over the course of that deployment pathway what the OPEX and CAPEX costs will be, what the emissions savings will be, what the actual kind of levels of deployment will look like, and along with various other variables.
Great to hear. And as long as the the carbon budget is as a document, it's obviously clear that there's even more work put into that, and that is the precise version. So thank you for that overview, Simon. In terms of overviews, here's what we're going to go through today. So we'll start by discussing progress so far and where are we against national decarbonisation targets. We'll then look at where we need to get to and how do we get there, which will focus again on this notion of cost optimization, which we think is key in, and as we put here, winning the battles for hearts and minds. And lastly, we'll discuss some implications. So what might this mean for the built environment? What might this mean for mortgage lenders or different sectors of the built environment, those involved with it, as we go through? So we begin, first of all, by looking at progress to date. So obviously, as you can see here, as the carbon budgets have evolved over time, the UK has continued to track successfully against them, to the point that we are the first developed nation in the world to achieve a 50% reduction in emissions versus 1990. Simon, can you talk us through these budgets to date, any nuances and changes between them?
Yeah, I mean, I think the key change to notice is there's a big drop in the carbon budget from carbon budget 5 to 6, and that's because the 6th carbon budget, which we produced 5 years ago, was the first one that took into account a new target of reaching net zero by 2050, whereas previously the target was to only reduce emissions by 80% compared to 1990 levels in 2050. So yeah, there's a significant drop there. And then I suppose the other thing to note about is that each time we produce a carbon budget, we also produce a pathway from the present day to 2050, and we that has to be based on starting where we are at that point in time. So if things haven't progressed as much as we like them to have done over the previous 5 years, we have to take that into account, but still try and create a pathway that delivers all of the carbon budgets on the way.
Absolutely. And obviously the headline from government has been that we are on track. We're leading the world in doing so, but we know from the data that progress has not been even by any stretch of the imagination. To the point that some of these lines are kind of this is showing us progress from all the largest emitters, from transport through to buildings, industry, agriculture, aviation, electricity supply, and you can see here just from the steepness of the lines how different progress has been across those different major sectors. those different major emitters. So how's the picture looking for property at the moment?
Is that one for me, Joe?
Yes, if you'd like to take it, Simon, go for it.
Yeah, I mean, as you can see, it's uneven, and depending on, I mean, I suppose the thing about buildings, residential buildings, is that emissions are quite volatile because they're very dependent on temperatures, and because they're largely driven by people heating their homes, and they're also dependent on energy prices. So depending on which data points you choose, if you choose 1990 and 2019, then emissions have dropped by about 20% across that period. If you look at slightly more recently, emissions have dropped by more like 35%. But that's because in the last couple of years, we've had an energy price crisis. So essentially, people have cut back on their energy use, and I think there's some important questions as to what degree that those more recent reductions are going to bounce back.
Yeah, it's a great point. I think overall we're looking at a reduction of something like 35% in emissions since 1990, which certainly compared to the last carbon budget is a lot higher. But just as when we look at budgets, we have to take into account weather. So if it's particularly sunny, for example, there's less emissions from heating, so we don't feel the need to turn them on as much. We also need to consider other behavioral factors as well. So the price of energy over the last few years, as prices have skyrocketed, usage has actually dropped because people feel they can't afford to have their heating on, which is actually quite a sad situation and leads to other costs to the economy because people are living in colder, draftier homes, and therefore they are more prone to illness, for example, which impacts NHS. So interesting question there around how far these decreases can be maintained, how far they are linked to behavioral factors, which could then adjust or change over time as the price of gas reduces again. At least we hope it will. So all of this is to say that actually progress has been not insubstantial, but certainly not enough for us to consider it to be scalable and achievable without dramatic change, which leads us on to our next question around targets. So across these different sectors, we're obviously seeing different paces of change, and that's reflected in the different overall targets we see. So for residential property or homes, as we've termed them here, we do need to go further and faster. And the budget requests a decrease in the region of 34.5 million tonnes of CO2, or 66% by 2040. And that's set against a 2023 base year. So far on track, but certainly more to do, particularly within the sector. How do we get there is the focus of our next section, which we think in today's more challenging and provocative environment and a more diverse diverse political spectrum, if you like, with more and more actors deciding to come out against net zero, perhaps for their own political gain. There's a big question around how do we take people with us? How do we win the battle for hearts and minds? So let's start with this key chart from the 7th carbon budget, looking at first of all, the capital investments required, but also the operational savings, which when you look at the chart shows you quite clearly that from 2040, we can actually save money based on the net cost of net zero. So Simon, talk us through this one.
Yeah, so this is showing the overall picture of delivering net zero across all sectors of the economy, and as you can see, from 2040, the OPEX savings start to exceed the investment costs. So overall that's a good picture, and this is largely because what's driving a lot of these changes is electrification in various sectors of the economy, particularly over the next few years in industry and road transport. And those technologies tend to be much more efficient than current technologies, and in a lot of instances, they save money. The picture is a little more difficult with homes because for energy efficiency measures and low carbon heating to save some operating costs and to reduce household bills, but the challenge is that unlike say in EVs, which we expect to become essentially the same price as petrol cars over the next few years, heat pumps are still considerably more expensive than gas boilers.
Okay, so overall, kind of similar to this, the message of the section before. So an overall strong picture, but obviously different nuances by sector and different challenges for each of us to deal with. It's interesting you point out the point around EVs in particular. This is one of my favorite stats when talking to people about net zero, and especially within this wide sort of messaging around it. Oh, it's so expensive and we can't achieve it. It's always important to point out that in many cases the technology is just superior. So if you think about the internal combustion engine, it's an absolute marvel of science. It's delivered extraordinary benefits for the economy, but in terms of sophistication, burning fuel to create energy isn't that far away from a campfire. So it's perhaps no surprise to see that newer forms of tech, including in this case electric vehicles, are much more efficient and effective. So if you look at stats from, for example, the US Department of Energy, you can see that the typical situation with a petrol engine car or an internal combustion engine car, as we've labeled it here, is that around 80% of the energy that you use within that vehicle is wasted. So when you turn your key, you put your car into gear, you drive off, a lot of that energy is wasted through friction, through heat loss, etc. Only 20% actually gets used to drive the wheels forwards. Now with electric vehicles, they're not burning anything, so they don't lose as much through heat loss. In actual fact, the situation is reversed. It's the 80-20 rule, but in your favor in this situation. So actually the energy used is about 80% and the energy wasted through friction and other means is the 20%. That then supports this sort of picture, which comes directly from the Central Carbon Budget. You can see in 2023, here you can see the vehicle cost in the darker blue compared with the running cost in the lighter blue. You can see how the vehicle cost in 2023, an electric vehicle was higher. They're more expensive to produce, more expensive therefore to buy, but the running costs are already lower because you're using far more of the energy that you pay for, even if electricity is more expensive than petrol at this point. By 2030, as costs come down, therefore, we've got a much better choice for consumers to make, with electric vehicles basically achieving cost parity in terms of vehicle cost, but still superior on running cost, ultimately supporting a much stronger adoption and uptake. So as well as being economically rational, it's technologically more advanced, which again supports consumer choices. Just as
Joe,
one last nod. Oh, sorry, Olga.
I was just going to say, I really like that this graph actually, but perhaps the one thing it also doesn't show is that this is partially driven by policy, kind of government, like UK government policy and international policy around pushing the electric vehicle agenda with car manufacturers. So it just shows the power and that link between what happens with market economics when policy can drive these innovations forward, and you get this tipping point within a market as well, where you get this kind of parity with the old, which allows kind of mass market adoption as well.
A great point. And I think it speaks to the challenge the government has when it comes to housing, because obviously with cars, they've got this one piece of legislation that you'll be able to buy or a new petrol engine car from 2035, and therefore, or 2030, and therefore with that one piece of legislation, they've cut the Gordian knot. It's a ginormous signal to industry. They need to invest and innovate. They're all doing so, and it removes them from having to pay for everything. Whereas with housing, we're still thinking around, okay, what's the piece of legislation we can bring to pass? What can you pass into law that drives industry to innovate in this way and perhaps doesn't put as much cost on consumers and homeowners? That's because we haven't found it. We're still thinking about things like government grants on heat pumps as rebates to support consumer choices. As one last nod towards drivers of action here, you sometimes forget when you look at a chart showing you CapEx and OpEx in terms of net zero as its own, you forget there's a wider situation here, which is extraordinary cost if we do absolutely nothing. So in a no action scenario, we're going to see substantial damage to the global economy. There are various different numbers out there, none of them extraordinarily precise and perfect, but all of them pretty much catastrophic. This data point here from the International Government Panel on Climate Change points to a 23% potential decline in annual GDP by 2100, equivalent to 19 trillion. This is a key chart on the left-hand side. It shows you losses, uninsured and insured losses linked to climate change since the 70s. You can have something which wasn't a factor a few years ago, now happens all the time. And if you choose, as we've done here, to overlay climate change on top of it, you can see a very, very strong correlation there as well. So you can see as temperatures rise, we see more and more major events happening, more and more damage to property and to people's livelihoods around the world, as well as to lives, of course, giving us yet another reason to act in this area. So economically rational, technologically superior, and averting crisis, plenty of reasons to support the shift to net zero. One last point here as well, and this is straight from the carbon budget, but there is this sense of, okay, well, we don't see wildfires like we do in California. We haven't got Florida's tornadoes. We haven't got flooding like Bangladesh. But this is something that impacts this country to a great degree. We do see growing levels of flood risk to a point that some mortgage lenders are now refusing to lend on high-risk properties. Rising sea levels, again, impacting the value of assets through coastal erosion. Heat exposure, so we're seeing more and more people admitted to hospital through that. There's also things like risk to agriculture. So when there's major flooding events that really cost that sector. There's also something they call climate whiplash. So with this weather events frequently changing, where we go from really heavy flooding to really barren and dry spells. So temperatures bouncing up and down, for example, and the impact that can have on our ability to grow food. That's the important economy in that sense. So there's obviously a cost to not doing anything, and there's also a cost, therefore, to the disasters that occur. There's also a cost to abatement as well. So this kind of article in The Guardian from last month, in fact, talking about how the UK had to invest 1.5 billion a year on flood defences just to protect the public. So again, a very strong economic case for taking action here. With so much action then, what are the next steps? What do we as a sector need to do to decarbonise home, to support customers to decarbonise home? Or what are the implications are perhaps in terms of government policy? Let's look first of all at the pathway for residential emissions. Simon, can you talk us through this one?
Yeah, so the top dashed line is our baseline. So basically we take current emissions and we try and work out what would happen to them in the future, but assuming that you basically take no steps to address climate change. So there's no kind of allowance for policy measures or action. So in the case of buildings, we basically we take current emissions and the current housing stock, and we assume that remains unchanged. If the houses have got gas boilers, they continue to have gas boilers. They have to replace them as they wear out, and we take into account those costs and so on. But you'll see there is a rise in that line, and that's because we also we make assumptions about construction of new homes, but again we also assume that they will be built to kind of just current standards with gas boilers, and then we also allow for some future warming in the climate, which slightly offsets that and brings emissions down slightly because heat demand is lower. You'll notice that baseline is a bit higher than the actual emissions, or quite a bit higher than the actual emissions in 2023, and that's because of this uncertainty about what's going to happen as prices kind of normalize. So we took 2019 levels as our starting point for our baseline, and then we have to work out how do we get from that the emissions in that baseline to zero emissions in 2050. And each of these coloured wedges represents the contribution of different elements of the pathway in delivering that. So the top grey wedge, energy saving practices, is basically an assumption about the steep drop in emissions that's happened in the last couple of years because of energy prices. How much of that might actually be sustained by changes in behaviour rather than bouncing back? And we just took an estimate of half of that being maintained. So that's that top wedge of savings. The next one down, the red one, is energy efficiency measures in existing homes and to a small degree existing appliances. And then the small light grey wedge is household appliances. That's basically household appliances that have direct emissions. So basically gas cookers and petrol-powered lawnmowers, and what happens if you replace them with electric equivalents. The green wedge below that is new homes. So if you take, we assume that homes are built at the rate that the government is targeting to build them, and if instead of building those to current standards with gas boilers, you build them with heat pumps, those are the savings and emissions you get there. And then the most significant wedge at the bottom is low carbon heating, and that is the savings that you make from fitting existing 29 million homes in the UK with low carbon heating systems, which are electrified heating. There's no role for hydrogen in our pathway this time, which is a difference to the sixth carbon budget. It would be predominantly heat pumps, with some role for heat networks and also direct electric heating. We have breakdowns in our pathways of those mixes, but they're kind of inherently uncertain because they depend a lot on the assumptions that you make about the relative costs of those measures and the efficiencies.
Okay, so huge role for heat pumps, perhaps, as we'll discover later. I didn't also realise as well, Simon, that petrol lawnmowers are so damaging to such a big slice of global emissions.
Well, yeah, they're not hugely significant. They don't have a hugely significant role, but actually, they're a real easy win. Petrol lawnmowers are incredibly inefficient, and battery and electric powered ones are far more efficient. So, and the technology's there, so that's an easy one to just get on with, really.
Superior tech, as you were saying. Okay, so let's take this lens then of cost efficiency, and the place to talk about, I think, is energy efficiency. One thing that I found really fascinating is the disparity in proposed rollout from something that's seemingly as similar as, say, cavity wall insulation and solid wall insulation. So we're really staying true to this key principle of taking a pragmatic approach, finding solutions that pay for themselves, and then putting that into the roadmap or the pathway as far as possible. So the cavity wall insulation, we're expecting 87% of those homes that can have them should have them in order to keep us on track to the pathway by the mid-2030s. For solid wall insulation, which typically is far more expensive and delivers far fewer energy savings. So as one example, a cavity wall may pay for itself 4 times over within its lifespan. Solid wall insulation will typically take about 20 years just to pay for itself. So it's a much worse investment from a kind of a household budget point of view. And that's largely why I think we're just seeing solid wall installations on just 15,000 homes, which out of a total of 29 million is arguably not that many. Sam, anything to add here? Or I already stolen your key points and then thrown you in front of the audience?
Yeah, so I think another difference between our approach to modelling for the sixth carbon budget and this time around is that we've only put in energy efficiency measures where they're actually cost effective. So where over the course of their lifetime, they save you more than they cost to install. On top of that, a lot of these measures have actually got more expensive over the last 5 years. So actually, the cost effectiveness of all energy efficiency measures has kind of come down. But things like solid wall insulation, they've always been expensive and complicated. And in the sixth carbon budget, we kind of forced those measures in for kind of other policy reasons. Things like we focused putting solid wall insulation in homes that were in fuel poverty, whereas this time around we decided to focus purely on the most cost-effective way of delivering net zero. So there are other good policy reasons that you might want to do more energy efficiency, and the government may choose to do that, but they're not part of the recommendations in our pathway.
Absolutely, and Ola, obviously this is something which at Kamma we've been working around for a long time. If you think about things like Retrofit Explorer, which will look at any property in the country and will optimize the retrofit improvements there. Do you think this is something that more of Kamma's clients should be focusing on? I think I might have lost you, Ola. Are you still on?
Sorry. Yeah, absolutely. I think some of the problems in the past have come from taking an approach where we try and force a big bang approach on consumers that just scares them. So where you kind of say, you need to do this, 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 and this, it's £50,000. And, faced with that kind of proposal, people are generally going to opt to do up their kitchen rather than think about all these different things, because that's kind of just the way consumers behave. So I think taking a more pragmatic approach, and that's what I really love about this carbon budget, is like just being real about like where we are as an industry, where consumers are as an industry, and encouraging like a green home improvement journey. So it need not be big bang. Like you can get quick wins, you can get ROIs, and you can do it in a way that is kind of your journey. And kind of helping educate in that way, you know, having dynamic tools for a consumer can see. This is one of the reasons we built our tool the way we have, is that if I do this, what does that mean? So if I put cavity wall insulation, how much is it going to cost me? What's the payback? And where will my EPC be, etc. So being able to be dynamic and having people play around with the idea, and tying up the idea with modernizing their home, like comfort, as well as just basing it entirely on an ROI argument, because you know, quite often people think in short-termist ways. So I really think that this approach and the recommendations of the carbon budget are very pragmatic and will actually go further as a result.
That's good to hear. Obviously, we've got one elephant in the room, which is really, Simon, the cost of a heat pump rollout. So there are some kind of key points here, such as, you know, a lot depends on the future cost of electricity, and the fact at the moment you can argue it's almost artificially high, because all of the mechanisms by which we support those in fuel poverty, all of the rebates, if you like, are loaded on almost as a tax, if you like, on the cost of electricity rather than on the cost of gas. But even with that bear in mind, we are going to have to make substantial investments here. So Simon, this shows us the cost of heat pump rollout as energy efficiency versus the OPEX savings. Can you talk us through?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing to say is that that these costs are based on long-run variable costs, which are kind of a measure of the costs to like the social costs to the economy as a whole. And whereas so if you did this modelling based on retail prices and the kind of the actual incentives that consumers would face, then it would come out slightly differently. But yeah, as you say, you know, heat pumps are an expensive technology. They are more expensive than gas boilers. We anticipate that they're going to get cheaper, but it's still hard to see a way that they become, you know, cheaper than gas boilers. In a lot of cases, they will deliver people bill savings, but it's kind of hard to see them consistently, you know, kind of being economically rational in the sense that we talked about earlier. But you know, there are but in the end, you know, we need to get to net zero, and these are the kind of the most cost-effective solutions. So I think the key really is to try and make sure that the right as many incentives are put in place as possible to get people to make this switch. And so some of that will be about support with the capital costs, which we have argued is going to be required for you know, for a considerable amount of time to come. And some of it may be about regulation, you know, whether that's to do with the point of sale of homes, or having, you know, a point where you can no longer buy gas boilers. But really, the key thing is to sort out the ratio between gas price and electricity. If you can, I think we've been looking at heat pump rollout in other countries, and other countries in Europe have been doing it faster. And the key variable really seems to be the cost of electricity. If you get that right, and people actually it actually starts to cost them less to heat their home using a heat pump than it does with a gas boiler, then that's when the rollout starts to take off.
Yeah, and there's a few points there you made that we find really interesting. One is obviously there's no installations outside of existing replacement cycles, so we're not ripping out functioning boilers and throwing in heat pumps almost for the sake of it. And also, any investments we make in heat pumps, you know, a portion of that would need to be invested in a boiler anyway. The cost is potentially lower. But also this notion around, okay, we're ahead in terms of our electricity supply. We're an island state. We have access to offshore wind in abundance, and we can use that to decarbonize the national grid quite rapidly. But we're much farther behind in terms of heat pump rollout. So the obvious question then is, you know, first of all, how fast do we have to move? And the interesting response is, well, not actually that much faster than peer nations. We're not advocating, achieving something exponential here. We simply need to match the pace of rollout that others are doing, and that therefore gives us an opportunity to focus on already created best practice. What are the situational conditions that need to be in place in order for us to support greater heat pump rollout? So it's an open question, but do you think it comes down to more than the price of electricity, or does that seem to be the single determining factor, as you mentioned?
I mean, as I said, there's a whole range of incentives that you could provide to get consumers to install these things. But we think the electricity price is key, and there are lots of ways that the electricity price can be brought down, not least by increasing the amount of renewables, which will reduce the influence of gas prices on the cost of electricity. But the rates that are in this chart, we basically looked at comparable countries to the UK, and we found that in the faster ones, they were on average achieving a growth rate of a compound annual growth rate of 42% a year in deployment of heat pumps. So that's what we based our modelling on. So you can see that growth from 2025 until the mid 2030s, and then by that point, you've then your supply chain and your demand has basically reached the natural turnover of your existing boiler stock. So you don't need to grow the rate anymore. You just need to keep going at that speed so that you can replace boilers as they reach the end of their life without having to scrap them. But I suppose the critical thing is that if you don't reach that rate by 2035, then you're not going to get to zero emissions from homes without at some point having to start scrapping some boilers. So that 2035 is an important target, and as 5 years have gone since CB6, and we haven't met the kind of targets that we were looking at for heat pump deployment then. But this time around, we've really got to get there, because we're kind of reaching the limits that we can that we think that the limits to the rates that we think this market can grow at.
Yeah, it's an interesting angle. We often hear from politicians, especially in the last few years, of we're still going to achieve net zero, but we're going to slow things down. We're going to achieve we're going to get to the same place at the same time, but by moving more slowly. And there's only so many times you can say that as a leader of a country, as the sitting government, before it becomes just impossible to achieve. It's interesting to hear that 2035 therefore is a key date, because obviously with a 15-year replacement cycle, at that point, if you aren't replacing boilers, you're installing new ones, which will take us past 2050. So perhaps that's a key deadline when governments need to decide either, yes, we're going to achieve it, and that will involve these compromises or these policy decisions being made, or we have to come clean and say, actually, there's going to be some challenges in doing so, and face the political and even legal backlash from that.
Well, or potentially, you just increase the costs of doing it unnecessarily, because you're taking out, you're ripping out fairly new boilers.
Yeah.
Simon, how much do you think pace of innovation could change the profile of this graph? So we've got like companies like Octopus Energy, where they are they have proved you can do zero builds homes. I know that's not rollable out to every single property that we have yet anyway, and claims that they're really going to bring down the cost of heat pumps. In my circles, I know a lot of kind of innovators in the space, because of the kind of the investment that we have from kind of green tech funds. And one of the barriers is actually the kind of speed of getting approval from government to be kind of registered with an EPC or SAP rating as well. And how much do you think we could, it's quite, 2050 is not that far away, but it's also long enough for quite significant things to happen as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really difficult one to answer for the economy in general. And we and many others have got it wrong in the past on the cost of solar and wind power. But I think it's even more difficult to answer for technologies like heat pumps, and that's because it's kind of less clear where innovation and kind of learning by doing will come in. EVs are built in factories, right? And wind turbines are essentially a wind turbine installation is pretty similar wherever you decide to put it. So there's a lot of scope for kind of incremental improvement that makes those technologies cheaper. Whereas heat pumps, I mean, the technology itself, there may be scope to somewhat reduce the cost of the unit. But if you come back to the archetype data set, to represent those 29 million homes, we still ended up with 11,000. To represent their diversity, we still end up with 11,000 archetypes. And I hope the UK's homes are very diverse and different, and so the challenges of installing whatever low carbon heating technology you need in one group of homes may be quite different to another, and it seems like it's a much harder problem to crack and a much harder one to kind of predict whether anyone is going to come up with better solutions.
Yeah. Great.
It's interesting, John. We have seen a few examples of other sources of electrical heat, or perhaps even heat pumps, which are potentially lower cost. So Octopus obviously are very proud of their home-built heat pump, which they are talking up as a cheaper alternative to the existing models. The other angle I think we could potentially take here is to look at the compound benefits, or we're looking at the additional savings you can make, where the whole package is greater than the sum of its parts, and that depends obviously on having the right data available to do that. So all I talked before about the importance of quick wins, of making incremental changes, or potentially even allowing people to have this home energy journey where they are saving money each year through the installation. Now, let's say draft proofing and better light bulbs and things and heating controls, and then potentially investing that in insulation, taking those savings, investing in systemic upgrades further down the line. That's a valid and viable journey when we have still 25 years towards 2050. For certain parts of the population that are potentially more interested, though, they would benefit from seeing more data and more insights perhaps around the compound benefits. So this data here looks at the impact of a heat pump. Obviously, they're 3 to 4 times as efficient as a gas boiler, but electricity is typically 3 to 4 times as expensive, and therefore the savings are fairly low. If you factor in solar PV, you're therefore using a lot more of your electricity from the sun, rather than selling back to the grid at a fraction of the price that you end up paying for it. And therefore that allows you to grow your levels of savings. We know from our own data as well that an insulated home benefits more from a heat pump than a non-insulated home. So for those able to support, say, a wider package, there are opportunities here to use the right data, use the right insights to make sure they realize that the compound benefit or the group benefit or the package benefit of taking these measures is mutually reinforcing, allows them to grow their savings, and potentially can get them to a place where it's still economically sensible. So for my own property, as one example, this is going to sound like a humble brag, but just to point out, I haven't used my own heat pump yet, but I have a heat pump and solar PV, and collectively that allows me to be very, very close to zero bill throughout the year, because I'm basically harvesting the sunshine and putting it into my heating system. So one example of how you can support some homes, even if the majority of others, they need to start somewhere at the cheaper end of the scale. Okay, we know we've got quite a few lenders here. So we wanted to quickly take a little step into the role of regulation. So we talked earlier about the banning of sale of petrol engine cars as that kind of a Gordian knot, if you like. We haven't seen something similar. Perhaps the closest we have seen is the return of minimum energy efficiency standards, or MEES. Obviously, within the marketing side, we love MEES because it's just so pun-rich territory. You can see here, is it hit or miss? You've also got, is it a mistake waiting to happen? The lines here really do write themselves. In terms of a challenge, you will hear over and over again, over half of the private sector is currently below a C. Therefore, it's too much of a challenge to get there by 2030. We also see data which shows us that landlord margins are being squeezed as never before. The price of money has increased. Their mortgages, where they exist, have gone up. Even if yields have as well, their margins are being made tighter and tighter. So there's a challenge of, if you are running a property investment company and your costs are going up and your income is going down, why would you invest in this? What's the benefit for doing so? And in response to that, you can look at things like the capital appreciation. So obviously, many people are property investors because they know that over time, the value of those assets will increase, depending on where they are in the country. At Kamma, we've done a series of analysis where we look at the cost to achieve an EPC grade C for private rental sector properties, and we compare that to the value of the asset to ask ourselves the question, is it affordable or not? And typically we get asked to categorize based on whether or not it is more or less than 5% of the value of the asset. So in both scenarios, we'll flag it, but we for the sake of argument here, we've categorized less than 5%, or 5% or less, I should say, as affordable, and more than 5% as potentially unaffordable. And by this metric, only 14% of the PRS properties that we've run are unable to achieve EPC grade C. So an interesting angle there, and how we can better support the sector to decarbonize, and also how potentially we can afford it through things like advantageous green loans, for example. All Simon, I've just talked non-stop for about 3 minutes, but any more points to add to this slide or on the subject of minimum energy efficiency standards?
I mean, I guess it's just worth mentioning that the government is, as you said, consulting on this at the moment. And alongside that consultation, they're planning to reform EPC metrics based on largely on some recommendations that we made to the government at the beginning of 2023. And so that means that whilst at the moment the EPCC standard is based on a cost metric, in future that's probably going to be a genuine fabric efficiency metric.
Do you expect it still to be because we've obviously the home energy model looking at various different metrics, including 4, and some of those being more closely aligned with the environmental impact of a property. Do you expect the language of regulation to still to be in this written in the sense of energy efficiency, or do you think they potentially might write these regulations based on those that are regulating out those that are most harmful to the environment?
So I mean, I haven't looked at the consultation in a lot of detail, but it's there for anyone who wants to. But as I understand it, so the previous metric was, whilst they called it an energy efficiency metric, was actually a cost metric, and so it was pretty poor at delivering what they actually wanted the policy to do, which was make homes make the fabric of homes more efficient. And so they're introducing a new metric that will do that, and that will be the one that they'll target. They're also talking about introducing metrics around they actually classify the heating system types, so they can start to use EPC metrics to actually drive low carbon heat, whereas in the past that's been quite poorly incentivized, because if you switch to electrified heating system, that often made your EPC rating worse. And they're also the government is also looking at incorporating some sort of metric on energy demand flexibility as well, which would start to encourage things like batteries.
Understood.
Yeah.
We've got a range of things. Sorry, Ola, please go ahead.
Sorry, I was just to add to that. I think it's quite exciting about the home energy model, and certainly I did read the recommendations from the Climate Change Committee at the time, and I think it's a much more nimble model that will allow kind of data to be gathered that can really help policy flex in the right direction to create the right kind of change. I guess the only thing to bear in mind is that initially it is going to be only applied to new builds. So we still have kind of the problem with our existing stock, and it's taken us since 2012, so about 12-13 years to build up to just over 50% of properties having the EPC certificate. So it's quite a long cycle in this change, but we need not be constrained still with just the fact that we only have EPC and the data is very limited. Kind of we have proven that there's ways and means that you can actually help enrich that to help make better decisions. And I think that the only other thing I was going to mention, because I've spoken to a lot of lenders about MEES, and there's a lot of concerns about unintended consequences, as there always is, because it is quite a big deal. But I guess I think where we'll land as an industry is that my feeling, and this is a personal opinion, is that it's going to go ahead. And the main reason, I think, is because, as Simon said at the outset, or maybe it was Joe, net zero is a legal obligation on the UK. So there's certain things that we need to run up to in order to achieve that by 2050. And the private rented sector is something where we can legislate around that. I think where we should be trying to influence is how we can have an orderly transition to that, so we have less of these unintended consequences as well. So, you know, as an industry, we can kind of consult, use the data wisely, and help inform an orderly transition that actually achieves what everybody ultimately wants.
Yeah, it's a great point about how ultimately delivering transparency, being clear with industry and with the wider public on what's going to happen next is key to, you know, maintaining this ability to transition without undue cost, undue risk being placed on companies or on people. On this slide here, we've got a series of different potential next steps for the government in terms of regulation, which all have been discussed so far today, and yet none of them are quite making it through the regulatory pipeline. In other words, they're all there as recommendations, but we don't have clarity. We don't have this transparency that we're just talking about. So the Future Home Standard, obviously a very contentious issue right now, with homeowners lobbying against, for example, putting solar PV on every rooftop. The clean heat mechanism, we had it in law, we had it out of law. And about energy costs, we know we need to do it, but we haven't quite got there yet. We haven't worked out perhaps how to do it without impacting those properties which rely a lot more on gas and maybe in fuel poverty, and therefore impacting impacting those which we don't want to, in order to deliver a just transition. This may be too much of a stretch to ask, Simon, but can you give us any kind of insider points on any of these areas?
Yeah, I mean, the Future Home Standard, we're just they've done the government has done the consultation. We're just waiting for it to be implemented. Our key concern with that, and I think this is probably clear in the 7th Carbon Budget report, is the length of the transition period once that does get put into law, because we're going to, there's a risk that we're going to be continuing to build new homes with gas boilers, until the end of 2027, which then will have to be expensively retrofitted. So, we just need the government and house builders to get on with building zero emissions homes as quickly as possible. The clean heat market mechanism has been put in place, but it's and essentially, for people who don't know, that's meant to ratchet up the proportion of heat pumps that manufacturers have to sell compared to gas boilers. So, because a lot of them are in both markets, but at the moment, the way that's been set means that the kind of financial penalties for not reaching those targets are very low. So that needs to be that needs to be enhanced, so that there is actually an incentive for boiler manufacturers to sell more heat pumps. And that's particularly important because it's addressing the really difficult to address homes, which is the majority, which is the owner-occupier sector, and making sure that we've got the right incentives in place. Rebalancing energy costs, I mean, we've talked about a bit already. There are various levies which the government just needs to make a decision on, where they moving them off electricity and either onto gas or onto general taxation, which would help bring electricity costs down. The government's also looking at reforms to the energy market, which could reduce electricity prices further. And as I said before, just increasing the amount of renewables on the system and reducing reliance on gas should also help bring prices down.
Yeah, so it's fair to say that even if we haven't seen the policies in place right now, there are working groups going through these things to see how else we can drive towards net zero. I'm conscious of time. I just want to very quickly wrap up with some key messages from us. What might this mean for the built environment? We've got 4 areas here to think about, and cleverly we made them all begin with the letter R. So first of all, risk. I think hopefully it's clear from today's presentation. We are going to see more regulations here, and if we don't see the regulations, then we're going to see disorderly transition and more physical risk, if you like. That will also impact on reporting, especially as we move away from TCFD towards ISSB requirements. And the ultimate goal, therefore, is to retrofit. One kind of silver lining we'd add here is we are starting to see some investors reward those lower risk greener assets with the mythical green premium. So if you are able to demonstrate to your investors that you are using these investments to support not just your ESG principles, but theirs, that can sometimes unlock a preferential loan rate, giving you a reason to do more in this area, but also to pass on to your customers. With that in mind, we're going to throw the floor over for questions.
Joe, I don't know if you can see the questions, but I can read them out if you can't.
Go for it.
So Nigel Banks from Octopus Energy, does the balanced pathway use current electricity and gas prices or some form of forecast? And are smart tariffs considered / used?
So on the first point, no, we use forecasts, and we use in our modelling long run variable costs rather than retail prices. We have a power team who work on decarbonisation and expansion of electricity. So I'm not an expert on exactly how those costs have been derived, but essentially, I think they're all available in the published data set that we produce with the 7th Carbon budget. And sorry, I missed the second question.
Were smart tariffs considered or used?
Well, in the sense that we model flexibility, and we look at whether the most cost-effective solution for a home includes having a flexible heating system. So that could be one where the house is sufficiently energy efficient that you can preheat it to some degree, and then during peak times you can basically turn the heating off for kind of 4 hours or so, or potentially that you invest in a heat battery so that you're able to charge that heat battery up when electricity costs are low and then use the heat during peak times. And then the way we model that is we use slightly different costs for lower costs for electricity for those homes. So yeah, it's not it's possibly not an exact analog to different tariffs, but it models those kind of incentives.
Great, thanks, Simon. Nitika, given the significant reduction in carbon budget for the sector and not enough progress being made on heat pumps installation or grid electrification, what reaction has there been seen from the UK government to help meet the suggested reduction on the back of the release? Or is it still a bit early days, Simon?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I can kind of go into our conversations with kind of ministers and officials, but I mean, I think that our pathway is meant to be a realistic pathway from where we are now, and I would hope that the government will see it as such. But in buildings, I mean, I think in the electricity system, good progress has been made so far, and that's where the vast majority of the reduction in UK's emissions has been delivered so far, has been in reducing emissions from the electricity system. There's been lots put in place to continue that. The government has this kind of clean electricity mission and aiming to completely decarbonise the grid by 2030. So that's already been pushed really hard. But over time, surface transport and buildings become increasingly important in the transition, and particularly in the 7th Carbon budget period. And yeah, I think everyone recognises that buildings is a challenging sector for all sorts of reasons, and is potentially is politically challenging as well, because you're having to basically tell people to make changes to their homes and persuade them to do that without risking a backlash.
Thanks, Simon. Kirsty, please can the slides be shared after the webinar? Yes, we will share a follow-up and a recording of the webinar. Quick one, I'm conscious of time. I don't know if you have time to run over a little bit for a few more questions, Simon.
Yes.
Yeah, we've still got quite a few people on, so great. Got a captive audience still. Katie, what assumptions are used to produce the heat adjusted numbers? Will the methodology document released in May contain detail of the demand profiles associated with adjusted and unadjusted historic numbers?
I assume you mean the assumptions around increasing like climate change, basically reducing space heating demand. So we use a set of government assumptions which are in some data called EEP, energy efficiency. I'm having a complete mental block on what it stands for. Energy, I think it's energy and emissions projections. And there is a time series there for a reduction in the number of heating degree days over time, and we apply that in our model. And that will be, yes, that will be explained in our methodology report, which will be published in May.
Great, thank you. Question from Ava Maria. Of our 29 million homes, how many are actually suitable for candidates for heat pumps? And someone has kind of chipped in there as well around that assumption for 2050 for the 4 and 5 homes to have a heat pump in 2050.
Yeah, well, so our modelling is for around 80% of homes to receive a heat pump of some sort. But as I said, there's considerable uncertainty as to what the exact proportions will be of the different types of technologies. And in some homes, a communal heat pump solution may be more suitable than an individual, or maybe the only option. So in flats or maybe particularly dense terraced areas, communal heat pumps might be the best solution. And then the remaining 20%, some of that will be heat networks, and I think about half of it in our model is heat networks, and about half of it is just direct electric heating of some form, just either electric resistive or electric storage heaters. But as I say, in all of those figures, it's very dependent on what the incentives are in the real world. So there may be a higher use of heat networks than we've modelled. There may be a greater or lesser use of communal heat pumps. The same, ground source heat pumps may become more cost effective. So yeah, there's a range of options. It's inherently uncertain, but I think in general, what's been shown over the last 5 years through various studies is that actually the vast proportion of homes are suitable for heat pumps, and this idea that you have to spend a huge amount of money up front improving energy efficiency before you can install a heat pump, I think it's now being shown to be less and less to be the case.
Yeah,
I think there's a man called Professor Jan Rossenaar who published a lot of data on this point. He's one of the original eco-influencers in that sense. We're trying to get on to one of our webinars. But one of his key points is that his own home is classic UK Victorian terrace and works fine with a heat pump. So the question maybe is around cost effectiveness rather than suitability.
We might not have time to get to all the questions. Sorry, we probably spoke a bit too much and didn't leave enough time for questions. But there's one other interesting question here from Karina about MEES. In relation to MEES, is EPCC, where possible, enough to decarbonise the residential sector to reach net zero by 2050?
I mean, on its own, EPCC, isn't going to tell you that a home has been decarbonised. It's just, well, at the moment, it's going to tell you it costs less to run. In future, as I said, it may actually reflect the fabric efficiency of the home. But then you've also, on top of that efficiency, there's efficiency measures. You've got to install low carbon heating. But yeah, I think it comes back to the previous point, though, that you don't need to necessarily have really high levels of efficiency in order to then make low carbon heating a viable option. So if more and more homes are achieving EPCC, then I think they're quite clearly going to be suitable for ready for heat pumps.
Yeah, it's a really good point, because I think that's why carbon emissions are so important to be measuring alongside energy efficiency, because you can have a very, very energy efficient home burning coal, so it's not in isolation. It doesn't help us get to net zero. Possibly I'll just run in one other question, I think, before we let you go, Simon. Sorry, you're the man of the moment. So many questions. It shows you, though, how much people are interested in care. House builders are expecting to continue to complete homes on gas boilers in 2029, assuming June 2027 end to transition period. Only 40% of homes built last month met the 2021 standards. Is there anything that the CCC can influence here?
So, I mean, my understanding is that with the way the transition period will work for the Future Home Standard is we would still expect there to be homes with gas boilers as late as end of 2027. I haven't seen anything to suggest it would be as late as 2029. But even so, we still think that 2027, that's still a few years of building several 100,000 houses that are all going to have to be retrofitted later and are going to be increasing emissions until that point. So we're we'll be pushing the government to kind of bring that date forward as much as possible, and I think we've made that point in the 7th Carbon Budget report, and I would imagine we will be making it again in future.
Yeah, it's a great question from Nigel Banks there, and it's a circle that is yet to be squared. We're drawing towards 3:10, so apologies for running over. We will take a copy of all unanswered questions and we'll circulate it as an FAQ after the session, along with the slides and a recording, so you can hear Simon and all his great contributions and my rambling at any time that you'd like to in the future. So thanks again for joining. Thanks to our panelists, Simon and Ola, and thank you to all of you for spending the last hour and 10 minutes with us. We hope to talk to you soon.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.